Was Jesus a good moral teacher, a legend blown out of proportion, or was he truly the Messiah? That's the question we're wrestling with today. No easy answers, just honest conversation about the evidence, the skepticism, and the claims that change the world. Welcome to Wrestling with God, Big Questions, Honest Conversation. I'm Cliff Sims. And if you've ever wondered whether Jesus was a real historical figure, a mythological creation, or something more, then this episode is for you. Today, we're tackling the question, Jesus, man, myth, or Messiah? We'll break down the historical evidence, address common arguments, and explore why this question still matters today. Before we dive into the evidence, let's talk about why this question is so significant. If Jesus never existed, then Christianity collapses as just another myth among many. If he was simply a moral teacher, then following him is optional. But if he truly was and is the Messiah, then his claims demand a response. So, what does history actually say? First, let's establish whether Jesus was a real person. Some claim Jesus was a fictional character, but virtually no serious historian, Christian, or scholar hold to this view. Why? Because multiple sources, both biblical and non-biblical, confirm his existence. Let's look at some of these sources. First, Roman historians. Tacitus, a Roman historian writing around 116 AD, mentions Jesus in his Annals when describing Emperor Nero's persecution of Christians. He states that Christus, from whom the name Christian had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of the prosecutors, Pontius Pilate. That's a clear reference to Jesus' crucifixion. Second, Jewish sources. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing around 93 AD, also references Jesus. In Antiquities of the Jews, he writes about Jesus, who was called the Christ, and mentions his crucifixion under Pilate. While scholars debate the authenticity of certain phrases, most agree that Josephus did indeed refer to Jesus as a historical figure. The New Testament. While skeptics may dismiss the Gospels as biased, historians still treat them as ancient sources that must be examined. These accounts were written within decades of Jesus' life, when eyewitnesses were still alive, which makes fabricating his existence highly unlikely. These sources, combined with archaeological findings confirming the existence of figures like Pilate and Caiaphas, build a strong case for Jesus as a real historical person. If Jesus existed, why do some claim he's a myth? The so-called Jesus myth theory suggests that Jesus was just another dying and rising God, similar to Horus or Mithras. But there's a key problem with this claim. First, the timing of the problem. The stories of Jesus don't emerge centuries later like many myths. The Gospels were written within a lifetime of the events they describe, with letters from Paul dating even earlier. Second, the Jewish context. The idea that Jesus' story was copied from pagan myths ignores the deeply Jewish roots of the Gospels. Jewish theology rejected polytheism and pagan gods, making it highly unlikely that Jesus' followers would fabricate a story inspired by pagan myths. Third, the lack of parallel evidence. When you actually examine supposed parallels like Horus or Mithras, the similarities fall apart. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection account is unique in its historical grounding and context. The Jesus myth theory, though popular online, doesn't hold up to scholarly scrutiny. So Jesus existed, fine. But was he really the Messiah? That's where things get more personal. His followers believed he fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies, including born in Bethlehem, Micah 5:2, fulfilled in Matthew 2:1, crucified and pierced, Psalm 22, fulfilled in John 19:37, resurrected, Isaiah 53, 10 through 11, affirmed in 1 Corinthians 15. And yet, many in his day rejected him because they expected a political deliverer, not a suffering servant. The resurrection is the hinge of this entire claim. If it happened, it validates Jesus' identity as Messiah. If it didn't, then Christianity is a lie. And that brings us to the ultimate question: what do you do with Jesus? I know some of you listening still have doubts. Maybe you're open to Jesus being historical, but you struggle with the idea of the resurrection, and I get it. It's not a small thing to believe, but consider this. Why would Jesus' disciples, who abandoned him at the crucifixion, suddenly be willing to die for him afterward? The best explanation is that they truly believed they saw him alive again. Here's another thing. If the resurrection was a fabrication, why didn't the authorities simply produce his body and end the movement? Here's something else. And why do we have accounts from skeptics like Paul and James, who had no reason to believe in Jesus, changing their entire lives after encountering him? These questions are worth wrestling with, and I encourage you to examine the evidence for yourself. Let's sum up what we've covered today. Jesus was a real historical figure, confirmed by Roman, Jewish, and biblical sources. The myth theory doesn't hold up, as Jesus' story is deeply rooted in Jewish history, not pagan myths. The question of messiahship comes down to the resurrection, and the evidence suggests something extraordinary happened. If Jesus was just a man, then he was either mistaken or deceptive about who he was. But if he truly was the Messiah, then that changes everything. And that's a question worth wrestling with. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Wrestling with God. If you found this conversation thought-provoking, I'd love for you to share this podcast with someone who might benefit from it. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can find my contact information at riverchurchdecatur.com. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep wrestling with God.